Hello everyone, Paul Hamilton here. I'm Shakespeare Fellow, Kingston University, and my paper today is entitled Trump, Macbeth, and Complicity. The topic of my essay today is complicity, how it is developed, how it is resisted, whether it can be used as a dramatic device against itself. The Shakespeare character, of course, most notoriously associated with audience complicity is Richard III, the poisonous, bunched-back toad, who is universally loathed by everyone in that play, but nevertheless holds them all in awe and fear, and has seduced audiences for centuries. What, though, is appealing about Richard wooing Lady Anne over the corpse of her husband, a man he himself has recently killed? Or his proposition to marry Queen Elizabeth's daughter after he has murdered her young sons? Is it the tyrant's sheer shamelessness, his audacity, his brazenness, his lack of humanity? Is that what seduces us? And if so, why does it seduce us? Shakespeare spent much of his career as a dramatist depicting how rulers that seem venerable, settled, and respectable are actually the opposite. Their power often originates in treachery, bloody feuds among ruling families, and illegal wars. But Shakespeare's deepest insight may have been the intuition that the origin of state power itself and of desire are coeval, that they feed upon one another. For the sovereign does not merely consolidate his power, he does so by absorbing the black and deep desires of the public. In other words, he constitutes his power in transgression. And to many, that is not repulsive. It is deeply attractive. Stephen Greenblatt, in his recently published book, Tyrant, Shakespeare and Politics, 2018, just published this month, recounts a story about the actor Richard Burbage, who played Richard III. Upon a time when Burbage played Richard III, there was a citizen grew so far in liking with him that before she went from the play, she appointed him to come that night unto her by the name of Richard III. Shakespeare, overhearing their conclusion, went before, was entertained at his game ere Burbage came. The message being brought that Richard III was at the door, Shakespeare caused return to be made that William the Conqueror was before Richard III. The story may well be apocryphal, but it suggests that the idea of sleeping with Burbage dressed as Richard III, the monster, was far from unappealing to members of the public. Why? In our own time, disgusted liberals have been left to wonder at the sinister magnetism of the monstrously repugnant U.S. President Donald Trump. How do Trump supporters account for their fascination with him? The refrain repeated most often throughout his campaign was, "He says out loud what we all feel, but are afraid to say." He says out loud what we all feel, but are afraid to say. A typical meme that circulated among young Republican women during the campaign featured an attractive woman in a swimming suit wearing a Make America Great Again hat. It read, "If you aren't a Trump supporter, don't bother to ask me for a date. I already have a pussy." Trump's id-disinhibiting campaign is, on the surface, difficult to reconcile with his law and order brand. But authoritarian power, it seems, incorporates desire by realizing the public's fantasies of transgression. A law and order platform incorporates desire through the public's sadism. Trump can grab women by the pussy. Everyone cheers. Attorney General Jeff Sessions will lock immigrant children up in cages and imprison anyone sneaking a puff of marijuana. All of Trump's supporters feel self-righteous outrage, or self-righteous satisfaction. For a large swath of the American public, that is an intoxicating combination. The sovereign's ability to constitute his legitimacy, not in spite of, but through illegal acts, is of course everywhere before our eyes in Shakespeare. Bolingbroke steals the crown from Richard II and has him murdered. Have I no friend will rid me of this living fear? He cries. After he assumes the throne, Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, himself refers to the way he plucked the crown from Richard. Hal's association with Falstaff and his Thieves of the Day's Beauty solidifies the association between Hal and his father's crime. Like George W. Bush, Henry V, whom William Hazlitt aptly calls an amiable monster, invents a pretext to go to war out of thin air. As Hazlitt observes, Henry, because he did not know how to govern his own kingdom, determined to make war upon his neighbors. Because his own title to the crown was doubtful, he laid claim to that of France. But as much as Hazlitt is repulsed by Henry's use of an illegal war to consolidate his power, he concedes that, ironically, Henry has become the favorite monarch with the English nation. When a monster, whether an amiable monster like George W. Bush or a brazen tyrant like Donald Trump, seizes power and then seeks to constitute his authority by, as Henry IV advises, busying giddy minds with foreign quarrels, or, through the persecution of vulnerable minorities, putting children in cages, the question arises, how do writers and thinkers refrain from complicity in the authoritarian violence? Shakespeare makes Henry's mendacity perfectly clear, but it doesn't seem to matter. His charisma acts like a spell that has prevented audiences for 4 centuries from fully acknowledging the cost of his illegal war. And one imagines it will prevent audiences for 4 more centuries from doing the same. One wonders whether Shakespeare, like Richard III, exulted in his power to influence a gullible public. Like Trump, did he ever boast to his friends that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody? Or in theatrical terms, that he could still have the audience cheering for a man who would have their naked infants spitted upon pikes while the mad mothers with their howls confused do break the clouds as did the wives of Jewry at Herod's bloody hunting slaughterman. Saturday Night Live, in one of its most effective satirical barbs, targeted Ivanka Trump recently with a mock commercial for a perfume called Complicity. Complicity is a seductive fragrance, but even a master of manipulation knows that a crowd can just as quickly turn on him. In Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's demagoguery effortlessly stirs a crowd to indiscriminate violence, most significantly against the innocent poet, Cinna. Tear him to pieces, he's a conspirator. I am Cinna the poet, I am Cinna the poet. Tear him for his bad verses, tear him for his bad verses. I am not Cinna the conspirator. It is no matter, his name's Cinna. Pluck but his name out of his heart and turn him going. If Shakespeare ever did worry about audience complicity, is it possible that when he came to write his great tragedies that he attempted entirely to rethink the mechanism of audience identification? If Shakespeare did, he may have come to recognize that exceptional violence such as Henry's cannot be merely externalized. If it is, then the magic trick of demagoguery works, and the audience merely cheers as the slaughter proceeds. In order to cultivate a deeper inward awareness of violence depicted on stage, Shakespeare may have recognized that there is a convergence between the violence of the sovereign to constitute his or her own power and sexual desire. As I said earlier, they are coeval. As Terry Eagleton writes, the law is not the opposite of desire, but the taboo which generates it in the first place. Paradoxically, it is not only through the law that we have access to the desire which it prohibits. Paradoxically, it is only through the law that we have access to the desire which it prohibits, since the prohibition is the first we learn from it. As St. Paul writes in his letter to the Romans, if it had not been for the law, I should not have known sin. I should not have known what it is to covet, if the law had not said, you shall not covet. That is why for Freud there is an unholy alliance between the superego, Jeff Sessions, and the id, Trump. The superego attempts to conceal what it regards as the shameful origin in the id by overcompensating with sadistic violence. The threat of wayward desire, though, is that since it doesn't recognize the law, it might, like Caliban, attempt to establish a kingdom of its own to rival and overturn authority. So Milton declares of Satan, he and the serpent had perverted Eve, when he really means that Satan has gotten the first convert to a kingdom that rivals God's. As Jonathan Dollimore argues, perverse desire and insurrection are inextricably bound. As a consequence, in Shakespeare, the signifiers of the perverse and the usurper often converge. So at the end of Henry VI, Part 3, the future tyrant Gloucester declares, "Then since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer it. Here a crooked body and mind become a crooked destiny. Ontology, rather crudely and obviously, becomes teleology." In King Lear, the pattern is reversed. Gloucester's sexual waywardness, his adultery, committed in the lusty stealth of nature, leads to the birth of a bastard Edmund, a thwart disnatured torment, who betrays his brother, compromises his father, leading to his blinding, and exposes the French plot to restore King Lear to the throne. Gloucester's momentary swerve upends the play's political order. Gloucester's momentary swerve upends the play's political order. Desire is that powerful. But the play that best captures the convergence of sovereignty and dissident sexual knowledge is Macbeth. For Macbeth is about the horrifying discovery that sovereign power cannot be legitimized except through an unending series of murders, which recall the lawless olden time ere humane statute purged the gentle wheel. And it was also written during the terrifying year of 1605, the year the gunpowder plot was discovered. Shakespeare had experimented with transgressive content of fantasy as a central motif in major plays before. In Othello, the central recurring fantasy is sexual intercourse between Desdemona and Othello, which Iago equates with bestiality. "Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe." In Hamlet, the recurring fantasy is the adulterous and incestuous sex of Claudius and Gertrude, the rank sweat of an enseamed bed. In Macbeth, it is the murder of King Duncan, first imagined by Lady Macbeth in her vivid anticipation of the murder, followed by Macbeth's cooing admiration. When Duncan is asleep, whereto the rather shall his day's hard journey soundly invite him. His two chamberlains will I with wine wassail so convince that memory, the warder of the brain, shall be a fume, and the receipt of reason a limbeck only. When in swinish sleep their drenched natures lies in a death, what cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan? What not put upon his spongy officers, who shall bear the guilt of our great quell? Macbeth responds, "Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted metal should compose nothing but males." Since 1351 it had been treason in England to compass or imagine the death of the king, let alone conceive of treasonous murder as the performance of a sex act. After the gunpowder plot had been discovered, the law was quietly overlooked because it was necessary for King James's government to allude to regicide in order to rationalize the crackdown on Catholics and the severity of the punishment for the suspected offenders. Of course, in the past, Shakespeare had depicted the murder of any number of sovereigns in his plays whose stories derived from sources at a safe historical distance. What Shakespeare does here is to take murder entirely off stage, but fantasy proves to be perhaps even more dangerous than direct representation. The central feature of Lady Macbeth's description, manhood, drunkenness, sex, and murder, are unconsciously repeated first by the garrulous drunken porter of Hellgate, who is roused after Duncan's murder to answer the urgent knocking at the south entry. Thereafter the motif repeats, like the knocking, again and again and again, throughout the remainder of the play. Faith, here's an equivocator that can square in both the scales against either scale. who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator. The reference to equivocation is an allusion to Father Garnet, who was a Jesuit priest who heard the confession of the conspirators in the gunpowder plot, though he did not otherwise participate, and was executed for treason. He became associated with the doctrine of equivocation that came to symbolize the treachery of the undivulged pretense of treasonous malice. The porter's joke echoes one that was making the rounds that spring. It is looked Garnet will equivocate at the gallows, but he will be hanged without equivocation. Once he finally lets Macduff in, the self-styled porter of Hellgate continues to harp on drink, sex, and Garnet's equivocation. Lechery, sir, provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. Therefore, much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It persuades him and disheartens him, makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in his sleep, and giving him the lie, leaves him. Just as the knocking connects the murder of Duncan to the porter scene, the anxious humor here refers us back to Lady Macbeth's fantasy of Duncan's murder. The spongy officers who are drunken and fallen into swinish sleep, the vulnerable, unguarded body of Duncan, Macbeth's performance both sexual and murderous. The porter sends all of this up while his gallows humor ratchets up the anxiety rather than providing any true comic relief. But what is the consequence for the audience of the porter's anxious reference to Father Garnet and by extension to the gunpowder plot? In my view, what it does is to create audience complicity. As with Macbeth himself, there is no process of temptation, there's only horrified recognition. Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Like Macbeth, the audience has already yielded, through Lady Macbeth's sexualized description, to the seduction of the forbidden image of the murdered sovereign. To articulate the image again would be to acknowledge that one has been seduced by it. Therefore, to know our deed, 'twere best not know ourselves. The audience can retreat to the safety of knowing a familiar self, or it can recognize a secret affinity with a perverse image of the murdered sovereign, but not both. It is an image that can be experienced, but not acknowledged. Like the sleepwalking Lady Macbeth, the audience's eyes are open, but their sense is shut. What Shakespeare's created is comparable to a version of the Marquis de Sade's Society of Crime, or the forbidden sympathy that the Scarlet Letter evokes in Hester Prynne in Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter. Sometimes the red infamy upon her breast would give a sympathetic throb as she passed near a venerable pastor or magistrate, the model of piety and justice, to whom that age of antique reverence looked up as to a mortal man in fellowship with angels. What evil thing is here at hand, would Hester say to herself. This is a community each of whose members is more intensely isolated for their recognition of one another. Here the question arises, is Shakespeare himself complicit with state violence? Like a loyal member of the Stasi, is he terrorizing the audience with the porter's speech, seducing them into imagining the murder, and then gleefully taunting them with the punishment they would receive if they actually carried out the very fantasy that he himself has implanted? Perhaps, but I think that something more interesting is taking place here. The porter scene is brimming with ironies. As James Shapiro observes, the allusions to Father Garnet are themselves equivocal. They can be read as both exonerating him and as condemning him. Did Garnet commit treason enough for God's sake? Or did he commit treason enough for God's sake? The sake of God? To protect those risking their lives for God? If that isn't enough, the source of the knocking at the gate is not a soul in torment like Macbeth, but Macduff, the man who will murder Macbeth and help Malcolm impose a new regime. The porter's continual references to the gunpowder treason call into question whether the man at the door is as different from Macbeth as he claims to be. In other words, as Pete Townsend once wrote, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. If Macbeth stands in for the gunpowder conspirators, who were in reality tortured, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered, then audience complicity does not lead to the feeling that justice is served in murdering him or them. Complicity with an antisocial fantasy of sex and murder does not seem a very promising place from which to develop a politics. But this is a fantasy that the Porter makes both unspeakable and deeply ironic. It denies the mastery that lust so ardently seeks. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. It seems to me that the audience complicity Shakespeare produces is less about collaborating with King James's regime, though there may have been some of that, than it is about asking deeper questions about how to undo the cycle of political violence. For dictators to be successful, they need to extort collective violence from the public. Those who oppose dictators need to find ways of withdrawing consent from mob violence, whether from those in authority or their own allies. As Jack Haberstrom has explored in The Queer Art of Failure, here is the affirmative promise of self-shattering, loss of mastery, and meaning. If conservative tragic theory constructs the genre as a form of secular theodicy, a ratification of the law of the universe and by extension the state through the blood of the tragic protagonist, and whoever he stands in for, then Shakespeare's production of sexual dissonance in the audience seems to declare a suspension of that lawmaking function. At the very least, the recognition of a shared guilty secret has a way of draining all the pleasure out of Macbeth's death, and rendering hollow Malcolm's triumphalist characterization of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth at the end of the play as this dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. It is difficult to imagine an audience fresh from watching Macbeth at the Globe Theatre, weary with the blood and violence, rushing to bay at the spectacle of the execution of conspirators similar to those those with the gunpowder plot conspiracy, or at least not with the same fervor that they cheered Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. Those of us who have seen a protester taunted by a roaring mob and then punched in the face at a Trump rally, or the Twitterati eviscerate a person's career overnight, might well agree that this is not an insignificant advance. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for listening to my paper. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great conference. Take care.